The plane doors had just closed and the cabin was filled with the low hum of passengers adjusting their seats, stowing bags and whispering quietly before takeoff. Sundar Pichai sat in first class, his body still tense from the endless meetings, speeches, and commitments that had shaped his week. Despite his global recognition as one of the most influential technology leaders in the world, he looked like any other tired traveler, slightly slouched, hands folded on his lap, and eyes heavy with thought. He was not traveling with an entourage, not surrounded by cameras, not wearing expensive jewelry or flashy clothes, just a simple shirt, a jacket, and a quiet presence. Across the aisle, another man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at Sundar with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. The flight attendant, a young woman with a sharp tone and a polished smile, moved briskly down the aisle. She carried herself with authority, and her words cut like glass when she spoke to passengers. When she reached Sundar, she paused, looked at his outfit, and raised an eyebrow in a way that made the nearby travelers notice. Her voice, though calm, carried an unmistakable edge. "Sir, I think you might be in the wrong seat," she said, her tone dripping with doubt. "This is first class. Economy is further back." A hush fell across the nearby rows. Sundar blinked, confused for a moment, then managed a polite smile. "I believe this is my seat," he replied softly, handing over his boarding pass. But instead of simply checking the pass and moving on, the attendant frowned, holding it up as though it were a counterfeit bill. She looked back at him, then at the paper again as if trying to catch a trick. "Are you sure you can afford this seat?" she asked in a voice that wasn't loud but sharp enough that others could hear. Some passengers gasped quietly. One man chuckled under his breath. A woman in the next row shook her head in disbelief. Sundar felt his chest tighten. He was not a man who enjoyed confrontation. He had always believed in humility, in staying calm even when provoked. But in that moment, the weight of every pair of eyes on him pressed down heavily. He could hear the whispers start. "He doesn't look like first class. Maybe he sneaked up here. People like him don't usually sit here, do they?" Every word pierced him, not because of the insult itself, but because it revealed something deeper about the world. Prejudice, assumptions, the quiet cruelty of judgment, it was all around him. Sundar forced himself to breathe, to remember that anger never solved anything. The attendant, still unconvinced, leaned closer. "Sir, if you don't step back to economy, I'll have to call the purser," she warned. Sundar's voice remained steady, though his heart pounded. "Please check the system. My name should be there." She hesitated, then with an exaggerated sigh walked toward the service phone. The murmurs grew louder now. Passengers debating who Sundar was, why he would claim such a seat, and whether he deserved to be there at all. No one recognized him. No one saw the man who had grown up in a modest home in India, who had studied by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, who had walked long miles just to attend school. They saw only what they expected to see. Someone who, in their eyes, did not fit the image of wealth or privilege. As the minutes passed, Sundar's mind began to wander. He thought back to his childhood, to the evenings when his father would talk about saving money for education, to the sacrifices his mother had made to keep the family moving forward. He thought about how often he had felt like an outsider, even as he climbed higher and higher in life. And now here he was again being told he did not belong, being humiliated not by strangers on the street, but in a space where respect should have been a given. The attendant returned, and her face looked different now, tight, pale, and almost shaken. She glanced at him, then quickly looked away. "Mr. Pichai, I apologize for the delay," she said stiffly. "Your seat is confirmed." A wave of silence rolled across the cabin. A few passengers exchanged shocked looks. Some suddenly straightened in their chairs as though realizing they had just witnessed something far more serious than a seat dispute. Sundar gave a small nod, his voice even gentler than before. "Thank you." He sat back down, but the humiliation lingered in the air. What none of them knew was that this moment was only the beginning. This small spark of disrespect would ignite a chain of events that would leave every passenger on that flight questioning their assumptions, their values, and the true meaning of respect. As the plane engines roared to life and the runway lights blurred into streaks of white, Sundar closed his eyes, not in defeat but in reflection. He wondered how many times in life people were judged by appearances, how often kindness was replaced by arrogance, and how fragile human dignity could be in the wrong hands. Yet deep inside him something stirred. Not anger, not bitterness, but a quiet strength. Because sometimes being humiliated was not the end of the story. Sometimes it was only the first step towards something greater. The seatbelt sign dinged and the plane began its climb into the dark sky. Sundar looked out the window, watching the world shrink beneath him, unaware that above the clouds fate was preparing to test him in ways no boardroom or headline ever could. The flight was only beginning, but so was the lesson that would shock everyone on board. The plane leveled high above the clouds, its engines humming steadily, but the cabin carried a strange tension that had not been there before. Passengers whispered in small clusters, careful not to let Sundar hear, though he could feel their eyes on him from time to time. The humiliation from earlier clung to him like an invisible weight, yet he sat still, his hands folded neatly on the tray table, his eyes fixed on the window where endless clouds stretched across the horizon. To anyone watching, he looked calm, but inside his thoughts churned like a restless sea. As the flight attendant moved back down the aisle with her service cart, she avoided looking at him. Her earlier certainty, her cold tone, and the sharp edge in her voice seemed to hang in the air. Sundar noticed the quick change in her behavior. Now her movements were less confident, almost rushed, and when she spoke to the passenger beside him, her words carried an unnatural politeness. Sundar wondered quietly about her life, what kind of pressures she might have been under to make her act so harshly, but then he thought again of how swiftly people could judge without knowing a single truth. The man sitting across the aisle finally leaned forward, unable to resist. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his watch gleaming beneath the cabin lights. "So you're Sundar Pichai?" he asked in a half-whisper, half-chuckle. "Why didn't you say that right away? It would have saved you the embarrassment." Sundar turned slowly, his eyes calm. "And why should my name have to prove that I belong?" His words were soft, but the meaning sank deep. The man smirked, shifting back in his seat, but Sundar knew the point was made. Food service began, and trays of carefully arranged meals were placed before the first-class passengers. When Sundar's tray came, the attendant's hands trembled slightly as she set it down. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Sundar saw something there. Was it regret? Or was it discomfort at being caught in her own prejudice? He did not know. But instead of holding her gaze with pride, he lowered his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." The simplicity of those words struck her more than any argument could have. Minutes passed in silence as passengers began eating. But then something unexpected happened. The woman seated 2 rows ahead, elegant in appearance and carrying herself with authority, stood up and turned to address Sundar directly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice strong enough to capture attention. "I just want to say what happened earlier was not right. I don't know who you are and I don't need to, but respect is not something anyone should have to earn by showing a name tag or a title." The entire cabin froze. Her words sliced through the uneasy atmosphere, and for the first time since boarding, Sundar felt the heat of gratitude. Someone had spoken. Not for him as a powerful CEO, not for him as a known figure, but for him as a fellow human being. The passengers turned toward the woman, some nodding, some looking ashamed of their silence earlier. The attendant shifted uncomfortably, her lips pressing into a thin line. Sundar looked at the woman and gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said quietly. But there was weight behind those 2 words, a weight that carried both his pain and his appreciation. Just as the cabin settled again, a sudden jolt shook the plane. Turbulence rolled through the aisle, sending drinks spilling and trays rattling. Gasps erupted as the plane dipped and swayed. The captain's voice soon crackled over the speaker, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are passing through some unstable air. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." In the chaos, Sundar noticed something unsettling. Across the aisle, the same confident man who had mocked him earlier was frozen in panic, gripping the armrests tightly, his face pale and his breaths short. The sharp suit and polished watch meant nothing now. Fear had stripped him of his composure. Sundar watched for a moment, then leaned across the aisle and spoke gently. "You'll be all right. Turbulence passes. Breathe slowly, just like this," he demonstrated, inhaling deeply and exhaling with calm control. The man's trembling slowed, his breaths beginning to match Sundar's. Gratitude flickered in his eyes, though pride kept him from speaking. Sundar leaned back into his seat, but others had seen the moment. How quickly he had offered reassurance to the very person who had doubted him. Whispers began again, but they were different this time, filled not with mockery but with quiet respect. As the turbulence eased and the plane steadied, the silence that followed was thick with reflection. People had seen something raw, something human. In the face of fear, status had vanished. Appearances had dissolved, and what remained was the simple kindness of one person reaching out to another. Yet Sundar knew this was not the end. He could feel it in the air. The humiliation, the apology, the turbulence, all of it seemed like steps leading toward something larger, something he could not yet see. His thoughts returned to his childhood, the lessons of humility and patience, the long nights of studying in silence, and the belief his parents had planted deep within him, that true strength was not about how high you climbed, but how you treated those you met along the way. The plane continued cutting through the sky, but Sundar sensed the journey ahead was about to test not only him, but everyone seated in that cabin, because sometimes fate used the smallest cracks to let the brightest light through. As he closed his eyes for a moment of rest, a shadow of unease flickered across his mind. He did not yet know that before this flight ended, choices would be made, truths would be revealed, and one single act of courage would change how every soul on board remembered this journey. The cabin lights dimmed, casting a soft glow that wrapped the passengers in a fragile calm. Outside the window, the vast night sky stretched endlessly, stars scattered like diamonds across a black canvas. Sundar leaned back, his mind heavy with everything that had unfolded so far. Humiliation, whispers, turbulence, unexpected kindness. Each moment had layered itself upon him like pages of a story still unfinished. Yet even as the plane seemed steady, he could not shake the feeling that something was waiting ahead, something that would test every lesson he had ever carried within him. As the silence settled, a soft cry broke it. It came from the back of first class, a sound small at first but quickly rising. A young boy no older than 7 clutched his chest and gasped for air, his mother's panicked voice trembling as she called for help. Heads turned instantly, and in seconds the cabin erupted with nervous movement. The boy's lips were turning pale and his breaths came shallow and sharp, like someone drowning above the clouds. The flight attendant rushed forward, but her hand shook as she tried to reach for the oxygen mask stored nearby. In her panic, she fumbled, the mask slipping from her grip. Passengers gasped again, and fear rolled through the aisle like fire. Sundar's eyes locked on the scene, and without hesitation, he rose from his seat. His calm presence contrasted sharply with the chaos. He knelt beside the boy, his voice low and steady as he spoke to the mother. "It's going to be all right. We need to keep him calm." "Can you tell me if he has any condition?" The woman's voice broke. "He has asthma. He forgot his inhaler. I don't know what to do." The attendant finally managed to secure the oxygen mask, but her movements were clumsy, her fear obvious. Sundar guided her gently, his hands steady as he helped place the mask over the boy's face. "Slow breaths," he whispered to the child, demonstrating with his own breathing. "In, out, slowly, just like me." Minutes felt like hours, but slowly the boy's gasps began to ease. Color returned faintly to his cheeks, and the mother clutched Sundar's arm with tears spilling down her face. Thank you, she repeated, her voice cracking. Sundar only nodded, his expression quiet, his focus still on the boy until he was certain the danger had passed. The cabin was silent now, but it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of awe. Passengers who had earlier whispered doubts, who had judged him by appearance, who had laughed at his discomfort, now looked at him with wide, humbled eyes. They had seen something undeniable, a man who carried power not in wealth or title but in compassion and presence. The flight attendant stood frozen, shame written across her face. Her earlier arrogance seemed to collapse under the weight of what she had just witnessed. For the first time, she approached him not with superiority but with something softer, almost vulnerable. I don't know what to say," she admitted quietly, her voice shaking. Sundar looked at her, his eyes calm, his tone gentle. Sometimes words are not needed. Sometimes only actions matter. The depth of those words struck her harder than any rebuke could have. She lowered her gaze, realizing that in a single moment, she had been taught a lesson she would carry for the rest of her life. As the boy rested peacefully in his mother's arms, Sundar returned to his seat. But this time the whispers were different. Passengers spoke of respect, of humility, of how appearances had blinded them. The man in the sharp suit glanced at Sundar with a conflicted expression, pride battling with gratitude. He opened his mouth as if to speak but then closed it again, the words trapped somewhere between apology and admiration. For Sundar, the moment was not about recognition or pride. It was about something deeper. The truth that kindness carried more weight than status, that compassion revealed character more than any introduction could. He thought again of his father's words, lessons that had guided him since childhood. Never measure a man by what he owns, but by what he gives when the world is watching least. The night grew darker, and the hum of the engines filled the air once more, but beneath the surface, every passenger carried the weight of what they had just witnessed. Yet even as calm returned, Sundar felt something else approaching, because sometimes life tested you not once, but again and again, until you discovered who you truly were. And as the plane moved forward into the endless night, no one on board knew that an even greater storm was waiting, one that would push every soul on that flight to the edge of fear, and reveal truths they had never dared face. The hours passed quietly, the boy now asleep against his mother's shoulder, the cabin wrapped in a soft stillness, yet beneath that stillness there lingered something unspoken. Passengers glanced at Sundar with newfound respect, but also with a sense of unease, as though they sensed the story of this flight was not finished. Sundar himself sat with his hands folded loosely, his gaze fixed on the dim outline of the clouds outside. He felt the rhythm of the plane, steady for now, but deep in his chest there was a quiet warning, an instinct he had carried all his life. When everything feels calm, sometimes that is when the real test begins. Then it happened. A sudden bang, louder than any turbulence before, echoed through the fuselage. The plane jolted violently. Trays crashed to the floor and a wave of gasps spread like wildfire. Lights flickered overhead, and the calm hum of the engines faltered. The captain's voice filled the cabin moments later, urgent and strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a technical issue. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts immediately." Panic spread instantly. Voices rose. Some passengers cried out, others clutched at the armrests as if holding on to them could stop the sky from shaking. The man in the sharp suit cursed under his breath, his face pale again. The mother of the boy held her child tighter, whispering frantic prayers. Sundar remained still, though his heart raced. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the countless times he had faced crises, not in the air but in boardrooms, in decisions that affected millions. Yet here, there were no numbers, no charts, no strategies. Only lives suspended above the earth, fragile and helpless. The flight attendant, the same one who had humiliated him earlier, struggled to steady her voice as she moved through the aisle, urging people to stay calm, but her eyes betrayed her fear. When she passed Sundar's row, their eyes met briefly, and for the first time, she looked at him not as a passenger, not even as a CEO, but as someone she wished could anchor the chaos she could not control. Sundar gave her a slight nod, a silent promise that calm was possible even now. The captain spoke again, his voice firmer but heavy with tension. "We have lost one of our engines. We are diverting to the nearest airport. The crew is trained for this. Please trust us." The words fell like stones. Lost an engine. The phrase repeated in the minds of every passenger, painting vivid images of disaster. Tears streamed down cheeks. Prayers grew louder and panic threatened to tear the cabin apart. But then in the midst of it, Sundar did something unexpected. He unbuckled his seatbelt, not recklessly but slowly, calmly, as though showing everyone that fear did not have to control them. He stood steadying himself against the turbulence and spoke, not loudly, but with a clarity that reached every corner of the cabin. "Listen to me. I know you are afraid. I am afraid too. But fear will not help us. If we lose control of ourselves, we make this harder for everyone. Breathe with me. Hold the hand of the person next to you if you need to. We are not alone. We are together." The effect was immediate. Some passengers turned to him with wide eyes. Others closed their own and tried to follow his breathing. The mother beside him clutched her son tighter, but her panic softened. Even the man in the suit, trembling and sweating, lifted his eyes toward Sundar as though he were the only solid ground left in the sky. The plane rattled again, descending slightly as it changed course, and for a moment it felt as though gravity itself was pulling too hard. Screams rose again, but this time they were quieter, mixed with sobs and whispered reassurances between strangers who moments earlier had ignored each other. The attendant returned to her post, her face still pale, but her voice steadier now as she repeated Sundar's words in her own way, guiding passengers through the safety instructions. She had been humbled but also lifted, because in the darkest moment, she had witnessed the strength of someone who had every reason to be bitter, and yet chose compassion instead. Minutes stretched like hours as the plane moved toward its emergency landing. Sundar sat again, closing his eyes, his thoughts reaching far beyond the cabin. He thought of his parents once more, of their sacrifices, of how many storms they had endured quietly so their children could stand taller. He thought of all the invisible battles fought by millions every day, storms inside homes, storms inside hearts, storms that no one ever saw. And he realized this flight, this moment of fear, was a mirror of life itself, fragile, unpredictable, but also capable of revealing the deepest strength hidden in ordinary people. And then, just as hope began to steady fragile hearts, the captain's voice returned, heavier this time, slower. "Ladies and gentlemen, we may have another issue." The words froze the cabin like ice. Every head lifted, every breath caught, every heart pounded as silence wrapped the passengers tighter than any turbulence ever could. The words hung in the air like a blade. Another issue. The passengers froze in silence, every whisper, every prayer cut short. The cabin lights flickered again, the low hum of the engines uneven, trembling like a voice breaking under pressure. Sundar felt the shift in the air immediately. Panic was no longer scattered, it was swelling, pressing at the walls of the plane. The fear was not just about the engine anymore. It was about the unknown, the possibility that the very machine keeping them alive was unraveling piece by piece. The captain's voice came back, calm but heavy. "We are experiencing complications with our hydraulic system. The landing gear may not deploy automatically. We are preparing for manual procedures. Please follow all crew instructions carefully." Gasps swept the cabin like a storm. Landing without gear. Even those who did not fully understand aviation felt the terror behind those words. Some passengers cried openly. Some gripped the hands of strangers as if clinging to life itself. The mother holding her child began shaking uncontrollably, whispering that she wasn't ready to lose him. The man in the sharp suit buried his face in his hands, his shoulders trembling. Sundar inhaled deeply, forcing his body to remain still when every instinct wanted to tremble. He had spent his entire life learning to navigate storms of doubt and fear. But this was unlike any boardroom or headline. This was raw survival. Yet as he looked around at the faces of those trapped in the same fear, something rose inside him. Not anger, not despair, but an unshakable calm. He remembered his father's voice from long ago. "When people lose hope, you must lend them yours." Slowly, he stood again, steadying himself against the rattling of the plane. His voice, though soft, carried like a thread through the cabin. "Listen, I know this feels impossible, but fear is feeding on your thoughts right now. We cannot control the engines, we cannot control the gear, but we can control ourselves. Every second we hold calm is a second closer to safety. Trust the crew. Trust the process. Hold on to each other. We are stronger together than alone." His words reached the passengers in ways no announcement could. The mother lifted her eyes from her child, her breath slowing as she tried to mirror Sundar's calm. The man in the suit raised his head too, his pride broken but his fear softened by the strange comfort of a man he had once dismissed. Even the flight attendant, pale and shaken, straightened her back, her voice stronger now as she repeated the captain's instructions with clarity instead of panic. As the plane began its descent, the cabin shook violently, overhead bins rattled. Plastic trays slid across the floor and oxygen masks swayed ominously above. Screams returned, but this time they were fewer, subdued by the steady presence Sundar had become. He sat down again, fastening his belt, but he continued to whisper to those near him, guiding them through slow breaths, reminding them that hope was not gone. The captain announced the approach. "Brace position will be required. Crew, prepare for landing." The attendants moved quickly, their fear still visible but controlled. The same attendant who had humiliated Sundar earlier stopped briefly at his seat. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "I'm sorry, for everything." Sundar met her eyes, and instead of anger, his gaze carried only kindness. "What matters now," he said gently, "is how we face this together." The cabin grew heavy with silence as passengers bent forward into the brace position. Hearts thundered, hands clenched tightly, and breaths came shallow and fast. Sundar closed his eyes, not in surrender but in prayer, not only for himself but for every soul around him. He thought of his family, of his children, of the countless faces of people who trusted his work in their daily lives. He thought of the lessons of humility, of resilience, of kindness, and how they had carried him from the narrow streets of his childhood to the seat where he sat now, facing the edge of fear at 30,000 feet. The ground rushed closer. The roar of the engines grew deafening. The plane tilted, shuddering as the pilots fought to guide it down. Every second stretched like an eternity. Then with a jarring crash, the wheels, or what was left of them, struck the runway. The entire cabin jolted forward. Screams erupted, metal screeched against the earth. Sparks lit the windows like fiery streaks, and the smell of burning rubber filled the air. Passengers clung tighter, praying, crying, bracing as the plane skidded down the strip. And just as hope began to spark that they might survive, the left side of the plane tilted sharply, grinding against the runway, sending sparks into the night sky like fireworks. The cabin erupted in terror again. People shouted. Oxygen masks swung wildly, and the flight crew yelled instructions over the chaos. Sundar's eyes snapped open and his heart hammered against his chest. He realized this was not over. The storm was still raging, and one final test awaited them all. The tilt of the plane felt endless, the grinding metal screaming against the runway as sparks flared like fire raining sideways across the windows. Passengers cried out, some with desperate prayers, others with broken sobs as the aircraft shuddered under the weight of its failing balance. Sundar gripped the seat before him, every muscle tight, yet his mind strangely clear. In the storm of chaos, he held one truth steady inside himself, that even if the end came, he would not let fear write his last words. Only hope. With a violent jolt, the plane steadied slightly. The pilots fought desperately to keep the nose up, skidding across the ground, smoke pouring against the windows. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the aircraft slowed, screeching, trembling, until the motion softened into a rough but complete stop. Silence fell, heavy and broken only by the sound of gasping breaths. Then, like a flood breaking loose, cheers and sobs rose together. Passengers clinging to one another, the weight of survival crashing down in waves of relief. But the danger was not gone. The sharp scent of smoke filled the cabin. Alarms beeped urgently, and the captain's voice broke in. "Evacuate! Evacuate now!" In an instant, the attendants rushed to open the emergency doors, their fear replaced with focused duty. Slides inflated, passengers scrambled, some pushing in panic, others frozen in shock. And in that frenzy, Sundar rose again. His voice, calm yet firm, cut through the chaos. "Stay calm. Help one another. No one gets left behind." His words carried not authority born of title, but authority born of presence, of steadiness when the ground itself seemed to vanish. He moved toward the aisle, helping an elderly man unbuckle, guiding the mother with her child, even steadying the man in the sharp suit who had mocked him earlier. The once proud man now leaned on Sundar's arm, his eyes wet with tears, whispering a broken, "Thank you." The passengers slid down into the night air one by one, their breaths shivering as they touched the ground and looked back at the giant machine that had nearly become their grave. Fire trucks rushed toward the smoking plane, lights flashing against the darkness, but every life was now focused on the miracle of escape. When Sundar finally descended the slide himself, the cool night air struck his face and he inhaled deeply. Not just oxygen, but the overwhelming truth of being alive. On the tarmac, passengers huddled together, some embracing strangers they had met only hours before, some kneeling in gratitude, others weeping openly with relief. The boy with asthma clung to his mother, his small voice whispering that he wasn't afraid anymore because the kind man had been there. The woman who had defended Sundar earlier approached him, her eyes shining. "You didn't just save him," she said softly, nodding toward the child. "You saved all of us in ways you'll never see."